In 1944, while entire Japanese garrisons were starving on isolated Pacific islands, and German soldiers were retreating through bombed rail networks with collapsing supply lines, American troops were lining up for hot beef stew, fresh bread baked by mobile bakery units, and coffee brewed in steel kettles within artillery range of the front. That contrast was not myth, not exaggeration, not propaganda. It was logistics, and it became one of the most decisive forces in the war. The daily life of an American soldier in World War II was violent, exhausting, and often terrifying, but it was rarely defined by systemic hunger. From the moment the United States entered the war, the Quartermaster Corps began constructing a global feeding system capable of sustaining millions of men across 2 oceans. Food was not an afterthought. It was doctrine. The most famous symbol of American combat feeding was the K ration. Designed for mobility, it came in small cardboard boxes labeled breakfast, dinner, or supper. Inside were canned meat products, often processed pork or beef, hard biscuits, chocolate bars, instant coffee powder, sugar, chewing gum, cigarettes, and sometimes fruit bars. It provided roughly 2,800 calories if fully consumed. Soldiers often complained about monotony, but the ration worked. It kept men mobile during airborne operations, beach landings, and fast advances. When positions stabilized, heavier C rations replaced the lightweight K rations. C rations came in cans: meat and beans, meat and vegetable stew, spaghetti with meat. They required heating, and heating meant some degree of control over terrain. Once heating was possible, field kitchens followed. The M1937 field range became the backbone of hot meal production. Gasoline-powered and modular, it allowed Army cooks to produce hundreds of hot meals under canvas tents. Within 24 to 48 hours of many amphibious assaults in Europe and the Pacific, hot food was being served. Coffee boiled continuously. Bread from mobile bakery companies appeared even near forward areas in France after D-Day. Soldiers who had stormed beaches under fire were eating fresh loaves within days. Bread production alone was massive. Mobile bakery units baked thousands of loaves daily once ports were secured. Refrigerated cargo ships delivered meat and dairy products into tropical zones. Cold storage units were constructed quickly at captured airfields. Ice became available even in Pacific bases carved from coral and jungle. Meanwhile, on bypassed Japanese-held islands, diaries later revealed soldiers surviving on drastically reduced rice rations, then roots, then whatever vegetation could be found. Hunger weakened entire formations before combat even began. The American soldier complained about ration variety. His enemy sometimes fought while malnourished. But food was only the beginning. Food kept a soldier alive, but morale kept him fighting. By 1943, the United States War Department understood something brutal and practical. A well-fed soldier fights longer, but a soldier who feels connected to home endures. That connection had to be engineered thousands of miles away from America. Beer was officially authorized for overseas shipment in 1943. It was limited to 3.2% alcohol and issued under controlled distribution. But it was real, it was cold when possible, and it arrived in enormous quantities. Breweries such as Anheuser-Busch and Pabst adjusted production to meet military demand. By 1944 to 45, millions of bottles and cans were being shipped monthly to Europe and the Pacific. It did not reach frontline foxholes under active assault, but once a sector stabilized, once units rotated to rear areas, beer appeared. Soldiers standing under palm trees on newly captured Pacific islands could drink something that tasted like home. In France and Belgium after liberation, beer shipments became part of staging area routine. This was not indulgence. It was calculated morale maintenance. Then came ice cream, the detail that still shocks historians. The U.S. Navy constructed dedicated ice cream production barges capable of manufacturing thousands of gallons per day. Aircraft carriers and fleet anchorages received refrigeration units and ice cream mix shipments. Sailors who had endured months of combat at sea could line up for scoops of ice cream in forward Pacific bases. Meanwhile, Japanese naval crews were struggling with dwindling food supplies as American submarines devastated merchant shipping. Fuel shortages crippled training. Food shortages followed. The American war machine was not simply feeding troops, it was feeding normalcy. Cigarettes were also embedded into daily ration systems. Billions were distributed during the war. Tobacco companies supplied pre-packed cartons specifically for military use. Cigarettes functioned as stress relief, social currency, and sometimes unofficial trade material. They were included in K-rations and Red Cross packages. For many soldiers, the ritual of lighting a cigarette after combat was psychological decompression. Mail remained the most powerful morale weapon of all. By 1945, the Army Postal Service was processing millions of letters weekly. Mail crossed the Atlantic in convoy ships, protected from U-boat attack. Once airstrips were secured in the Pacific, air transport accelerated delivery. Soldiers measured weeks by mail call. A letter from home could shift a man's entire mental state. On isolated Japanese islands, soldiers often received nothing. Months would pass without contact. Isolation erodes will. The American system fought isolation deliberately. Entertainment units followed supply lines. The United Service Organizations coordinated more than 400,000 live performances during the war. Bob Hope toured relentlessly. Marlene Dietrich sang near the front lines in Europe. Performers flew into Pacific bases carved out of jungle. Portable film projectors screened Hollywood movies weeks after U.S. release. Soldiers watched films sitting on ammunition crates beneath canvas screens. Baseball fields were carved from coral and dirt in places like Saipan, Guam, and the Philippines. Organized leagues formed. Thousands attended games. For 9 innings, war receded into predictable structure. There were rules. There were innings. There were cheers. Contrast this with Axis conditions by 1944 to 45. German rail networks were being destroyed by bombing. Fuel plants were targeted systematically. Soldiers retreated on foot when tanks ran dry. Food shortages spread among civilians and troops. Japanese forces faced naval blockade. Rice shipments failed to arrive. Island garrisons weakened from malnutrition before battle began. The American soldier still ate. He still drank coffee. He still received letters. He still played baseball when rotated to rear zones. This did not make him invincible. He still froze in the Ardennes. He still bled on Okinawa. He still faced artillery, ambush, and death. But he did not fight hungry in the same way his enemies increasingly did. The difference grew month after month. Behind every frontline rifleman stood a convoy ship. Behind every hot meal stood a fuel tanker. Behind every beer bottle stood an industrial brewery operating on American soil untouched by bombing. Behind every baseball game stood a shipping lane controlled by the U.S. Navy. War is destruction, but sustained war is supply. And by 1944, supply had become a weapon. A soldier's day in World War II did not begin with glory. It began with routine. If he was near the front, he woke in mud, sand, snow, or jungle humidity. If the line was active, he might start with cold rations. But if the sector had stabilized, even briefly, hot chow became the goal. Sea rations came in heavy steel cans. Meat and beans, meat and vegetable stew, spaghetti with meat sauce, ham and lima beans, infamous among troops. Each meal came with crackers, coffee, sugar, and cigarettes. When possible, soldiers heated cans directly in boiling water or over small fuel tablets. The taste was rarely praised, but the calories were real. Roughly 3,000 calories per day could be delivered consistently when supply lines functioned. Behind those cans stood entire chains of canning factories operating 24 hours a day in the United States. Labels stamped in American plants ended up stacked in muddy foxholes in Belgium and coral ridges in the Pacific. Once ports were captured, more complex feeding began. Mobile bakery companies were deployed in Europe almost immediately after D-Day. These units produced thousands of fresh loaves daily. Soldiers who had eaten processed biscuits for weeks suddenly tasted fresh bread in liberated French towns. Bread was more than food. It was civilization reintroduced into war zones. Field butchers and refrigeration units followed behind. Refrigerated cargo vessels delivered frozen beef and pork into newly secured ports. Cold storage facilities were erected rapidly. Even in tropical Pacific climates, ice was manufactured locally once generators and refrigeration plants were operational. Hot coffee never stopped flowing. It was issued at breakfast, after patrols, during freezing nights in the Ardennes, and under torrential monsoon rains in New Guinea. Coffee was purchased in staggering quantities, hundreds of thousands of tons over the course of the war. But feeding was only part of daily life. Hygiene became a battlefield of its own. Trench foot in Europe and fungal infections in the Pacific could disable entire units. So portable shower units were constructed once terrain allowed. Laundry companies operated in rear areas. Clean socks were issued regularly when supply permitted. The Army recognized that infection could cost more manpower than bullets. Malaria control in the Pacific became mandatory policy. Atabrine tablets were distributed daily. Soldiers complained about side effects, but compliance was enforced. Without malaria suppression, divisions could have been crippled in jungle theaters. Medical evacuation chains became increasingly efficient as the war progressed. Aid stations stabilized wounded. Field hospitals performed surgery. Evacuation hospitals transferred severe cases to general hospitals further from the front. Hospital ships transported thousands across oceans. Blood plasma shipments became standardized. By 1944 to 45, penicillin began reaching combat theaters in increasing quantities. The result was measurable. Survival rates for wounded American soldiers were significantly higher than in World War I. While American medical logistics improved, Axis medical systems deteriorated under bombing and supply shortages. German hospitals struggled with shortages of anesthetics and antibiotics by late 1944. Japanese units on isolated islands lacked adequate medical supplies altogether. Now look at industrial scale. In 1944 alone, the United States produced roughly 96,000 aircraft. That included bombers, fighters, transports, and reconnaissance planes. Tank production surged into the tens of thousands. Truck production exceeded hundreds of thousands annually. 2 million trucks were manufactured during the war. Trucks carried rations, fuel, artillery shells, replacement boots, and mail. Oil production dwarfed Axis capacity. The United States produced the majority of the world's oil supply during the war. Fuel kept ships moving, aircraft flying, and trucks delivering. Germany relied increasingly on synthetic fuel plants, which were systematically bombed. Japan relied on oil imports from Southeast Asia, which were cut off by submarine warfare. The American soldier might have been exhausted. He might have been terrified. But he was rarely abandoned by supply. By late 1944, the contrast was visible on the battlefield. German soldiers retreating through France often lacked sufficient fuel to move armored units. Japanese island garrisons faced starvation. American soldiers still received mail and hot meals once positions stabilized. War had become industrial gravity. One side was shrinking, the other was expanding, and daily life reflected it. The American soldier's routine oscillated between violence and structure. One day he might be pinned under artillery. The next, he might stand in line for fresh bread and coffee. Weeks later, in a secured zone, he might attend a USO show or watch a movie projected against canvas. That rhythm prevented psychological collapse. Morale is not an abstract concept. It is sustained by small consistencies: a hot meal, a clean pair of socks, a letter from home, a baseball game under palm trees. The American system engineered those consistencies across oceans, and that engineering became decisive. By the autumn of 1944, the war stopped being symmetrical. It was no longer two machines colliding at equal speed. It became one machine expanding, while the other suffocated. In France, after the breakout from Normandy, American forces moved so fast that supply lines strained to keep up. Fuel became the limiting factor, not courage. Tanks outran depots. Infantry advanced beyond established railheads. For a brief moment, the machine stretched thin. The response was not retreat, it was acceleration. The Red Ball Express was created almost overnight. Thousands of trucks ran in continuous rotation between the Normandy beaches and forward units. Drivers operated day and night, headlights often blacked out. At peak, more than 12,000 tons of supplies moved daily. Fuel in jerry cans, artillery shells, replacement parts, rations, mail. Those trucks were not glamorous, but they kept armored divisions operational. Contrast that with Germany in the same period. Allied bombing campaigns had destroyed key rail yards. Bridges lay in ruins. Synthetic fuel plants were targeted relentlessly. Panzer divisions increasingly lacked gasoline. Some units retreated simply because they could not move. The Luftwaffe had aircraft, but insufficient aviation fuel to train pilots properly. German soldiers in late 1944 marched through devastated infrastructure, often short on food and ammunition. Civilian populations were already experiencing ration collapse. Rail transport, once the backbone of German logistics, was fragmenting. In the Pacific, the asymmetry was even harsher. By 1944, American submarines had decimated Japanese merchant shipping. Oil tankers were sunk faster than Japan could replace them. Without oil, ships remained in harbor. Without shipping, food could not reach island garrisons. Japanese units on bypassed islands were left to survive on stored rice that dwindled month after month. Once rice stocks were gone, men survived on roots, wild plants, and whatever could be scavenged. Diaries recovered after the war documented starvation, disease, and despair. Meanwhile, American amphibious assaults were followed by floating supply cities. When U.S. forces landed on Saipan, Guam, Leyte, and later Okinawa, fleets of cargo vessels followed immediately behind assault waves. Fuel ships anchored offshore. Refrigerated cargo vessels delivered meat and dairy. Construction battalions, the Seabees, built airstrips within weeks. Warehouses rose where jungle once stood. At Ulithi Atoll, the U.S. Navy created one of the largest fleet anchorages in history. Hundreds of ships could anchor simultaneously. Floating dry docks repaired damaged vessels. Supply ships offloaded ammunition and rations continuously. Hospital ships operated nearby. Even under kamikaze attack during Okinawa, the supply chain did not collapse. Ships were hit, but replacements arrived. Ammunition was replenished. Food deliveries continued. Mail continued. The Japanese defenders on Okinawa were cut off. Reinforcements were limited. Supplies were finite. As the battle dragged on, shortages intensified. This is the brutal truth. Hunger erodes combat strength silently. A malnourished soldier tires faster, thinks slower, recovers poorly from wounds. Disease spreads more easily. An adequately fed soldier does not become superhuman, but he remains operational. By early 1945, the American industrial system had reached overwhelming dominance. Oil production in the United States exceeded that of the Axis powers combined. Aircraft production outpaced losses. Shipyards were still launching vessels at record rates. Trucks, the invisible backbone of war, continued rolling off assembly lines by the hundreds of thousands. The American soldier in the Ardennes might freeze in a foxhole, but fuel trucks were moving behind him. The Marine on Iwo Jima might fight through volcanic ash, but rations followed once ground stabilized. The infantrymen on Okinawa might endure relentless rain and artillery, but hospital ships waited offshore. War is not just who fights harder. It is who can fight longer. And by 1944 to 45, one side was running out of fuel, food, and replacement capacity, while the other was still shipping beer, ice cream mix, fresh bread, and millions of letters across the ocean. The imbalance was irreversible. By early 1945, the war had stopped pretending to be balanced. In Europe, American and Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March. Pontoon bridges were assembled under fire. Within days, armored columns were pushing deep into Western Germany. What followed behind them was not chaos. It was structure. Fuel depots moved forward. Field bakeries expanded into captured towns. Medical units set up inside German buildings. Mail still arrived. Germany, meanwhile, was collapsing from within. Allied bombing had shattered rail networks beyond quick repair. Synthetic fuel plants, the lifeline of German mechanized warfare, had been repeatedly destroyed. Trains lacked coal. Trucks lacked gasoline. Tanks often could not maneuver because fuel was rationed to critical missions only. Infantry formations marched on foot across devastated landscapes. Food shortages intensified for both civilians and soldiers. Bread rations were cut. Meat was scarce. Transport bottlenecks prevented redistribution of what little remained. The Wehrmacht still fought with discipline in many areas, but the foundation beneath it, fuel and food, was gone. The American soldier advancing into Germany was exhausted. He had fought through hedgerows, snow, and artillery barrages. But when ground stabilized, hot chow followed. Coffee boiled. Medical evacuation functioned. Replacement gear was issued. It was not luxury. It was continuity. In the Pacific, the asymmetry was even more severe. By 1945, Japan was under near total blockade. American submarines had destroyed the majority of its merchant fleet. Oil imports from Southeast Asia had been cut off. Fuel was rationed at critical levels. Pilot training hours were slashed because aviation fuel was scarce. Ships remained in harbor to conserve reserves. Industrial production inside Japan was being crippled by strategic bombing. Transportation networks were damaged. Food shortages spread across cities. American forces preparing for a possible invasion of Japan were doing the opposite. Stockpiles accumulated across Pacific bases. Millions of tons of supplies were staged in the Marianas, the Philippines, and Okinawa. Amphibious fleets assembled. Replacement divisions trained. Medical infrastructure expanded. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, would have required unprecedented logistical effort, and the United States was ready to attempt it. Japan was not ready to sustain it. Then came August 1945. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the Soviet declaration of war, and surrender. The war ended before the largest amphibious invasion in history could begin. But the preparation itself revealed the imbalance. One side was stockpiling fuel, food, and ammunition at scale. The other was rationing rice and fuel to minimal levels. When the surrender was announced, American bases erupted in celebration. Beer was distributed from depots that had been stocked for months. Bands played. Flares shot into the sky. Letters were written home immediately. But even in celebration, the logistical machine did not stop. Ships that had carried tanks began carrying men home. Transport vessels filled with soldiers instead of artillery shells. Supply officers shifted from war distribution to demobilization planning. Factories prepared to transition from military output to civilian production. The American soldier who had once eaten a K ration under fire boarded a transport ship with a duffel bag and a return ticket. The enemy he had faced had often fought with equal courage. But by 1945, that enemy fought with shrinking resources, shrinking mobility, and shrinking food reserves. The American soldier fought exhausted, but supplied. And that difference accumulated month after month until one side could no longer sustain war while the other still could. War is brutality at the front, but victory is decided by what happens behind it. War does not only attack the body, it attacks the mind. By 1944, American military planners understood that fatigue, fear, and isolation could destroy fighting effectiveness, even when ammunition was plentiful. A soldier who feels cut off, forgotten, or permanently trapped in chaos begins to deteriorate long before he is physically defeated. That is why logistics was not limited to bullets and bread. It extended to mail sacks, baseball bats, movie reels, and coffee kettles. Mail call was often the most important moment of the day. Millions of letters crossed oceans weekly. Ships braved U-boat waters in the Atlantic. Cargo planes landed on rough Pacific airstrips, carrying sacks filled with envelopes. Soldiers lined up by unit as names were called. A single letter from home could stabilize a man's morale more effectively than any speech. It reminded him that life existed beyond mud, artillery, and jungle rot. German soldiers late in the war experienced increasing mail disruption as rail networks were bombed. Japanese island garrisons often received no mail at all once cut off. Isolation deepened. The American soldiers still opened envelopes, routine matters in war. Coffee became ritual. At dawn, before patrol. After night watch. During freezing nights in Belgium. Under rain in New Guinea. Coffee was not merely caffeine, it was familiarity. The smell of brewing coffee drifting through a temporary camp signaled that systems still functioned. Baseball fields appeared wherever ground allowed. On Saipan, Guam, and the Philippines, engineers flattened coral and dirt into makeshift diamonds. Organized leagues formed. Thousands attended games. Soldiers who had fought days earlier stood in the outfield wearing improvised uniforms. The crack of a bat replaced artillery for a few hours. Boxing matches were organized. Football games were played in England during the build-up to D-Day. Libraries circulated books. Chess sets and playing cards traveled in supply crates. The United Service Organizations operated at scale. More than 400,000 performances were staged during the war. Bob Hope toured repeatedly. Entertainers flew into forward bases carved from jungle or mud. Portable projectors screened Hollywood films weeks after American release. Soldiers sat on ammunition crates beneath canvas screens and watched stories from home. These were not luxuries detached from war. They were structured interruptions of trauma. Meanwhile, on the Axis side, as supply deteriorated, so did morale infrastructure. Japanese garrisons under blockade had little entertainment, little mail, and dwindling food. German cities under bombing endured blackouts and rationing. Civilian hardship fed military strain. American forces were not immune to stress or breakdown. Combat fatigue cases rose sharply in prolonged battles. But the logistical system continuously reintroduced fragments of normal life. Clean socks reduced trench foot. Atabrine tablets suppressed malaria. Field showers reduced infection. Dental units repaired teeth. Hospital ships evacuated wounded thousands of miles from combat. Small consistencies prevented cascading collapse. War demands endurance. Endurance is not sustained by heroism alone. It is sustained by repetition. Hot meals following stabilization. Letters arriving after weeks of silence. Structured recreation after chaos. By 1945, the difference in morale infrastructure was as decisive as the difference in fuel production. One side was shrinking psychologically under blockade and bombing. The other, though traumatized, was continuously reinforced by routine. The American soldier did not fight because he had beer and baseball. He endured because he was never completely cut off. The system refused to let him disappear into isolation. Shipment after shipment, letter after letter, game after game, coffee after coffee. The machine fed not only his body, but his connection to home. By the final months of the war, the contrast was no longer subtle. It was mathematical. Germany in early 1945 was collapsing under destroyed infrastructure. Fuel plants had been bombed into rubble. Rail networks were fragmented. Civilian rationing tightened. Soldiers retreated through cities without reliable supply. The Wehrmacht still fought in pockets with discipline and ferocity, but fuel shortages immobilized armored divisions. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Food convoys could not always reach forward positions. In the Pacific, Japan faced blockade. Submarine warfare had decimated merchant shipping. Oil imports were strangled. Aviation fuel was scarce. Training hours were cut. Ships remained docked because there was not enough fuel to risk them. Island garrisons weakened from starvation long before surrender. Meanwhile, American supply charts told a different story. Liberty ships continued crossing oceans. Oil production inside the United States exceeded that of the Axis powers combined. Aircraft rolled off assembly lines in unprecedented numbers. Trucks, the invisible backbone of the war, continued delivering fuel, rations, medical supplies, and mail. By 1945, the United States had produced more than 300,000 aircraft during the war, nearly 90,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, over 2 million trucks, thousands of cargo ships. Those numbers were not abstract. They translated directly into food arriving on time, fuel reaching armored columns, wounded evacuated efficiently, and soldiers rotated through rest areas where hot meals and beer awaited. When American forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, supply moved with them. Pontoon bridges were assembled, and fuel tankers rolled across within days. Field kitchens followed. Medical units expanded into captured towns. Mail sacks were sorted in buildings that weeks earlier had been under artillery fire. In the Pacific, stockpiles for the planned invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, were growing rapidly. Millions of tons of equipment and rations were being staged across island bases. Amphibious fleets assembled. The logistical machine was prepared to sustain another massive campaign. Japan was not. By August 1945, the imbalance was terminal. Cities were bombed. Transportation was fractured. Food shortages spread through civilian populations. Soldiers at home trained with limited ammunition and improvised weapons. The war could not be sustained materially. Then came surrender. When Germany capitulated in May 1945, American troops celebrated in occupied towns with beer that had crossed the Atlantic. When Japan surrendered in August, Pacific bases erupted in relief. Flares lit the sky, bands played, letters home were written instantly. The ships did not stop moving. They turned around. Transport vessels that had carried artillery shells and canned rations began carrying men home. Demobilization required the same logistical precision that invasion had required. Millions of soldiers were transported across oceans in months. Equipment was cataloged, stored, or repurposed. Factories prepared to shift from tanks and bombers to refrigerators and automobiles. The American soldier who once opened a K-ration under fire now stood on a transport deck, watching the horizon fade toward home. He had fought through mud, coral, snow, and jungle. He had endured artillery and machine gun fire, but he had rarely endured starvation. He had rarely been completely isolated from home. He had rarely lacked fuel, ammunition, or medical evacuation. The enemy he faced often fought with equal courage. But by 1944 to 45, that enemy fought with shrinking fuel, shrinking rations, shrinking reinforcement. The American soldier fought exhausted, but sustained. War is brutality at the front. Victory is decided behind it. Shipment after shipment, convoy after convoy, truck after truck, hot meal after cold night, letter after letter. While one side rationed rice and gasoline, the other kept baking bread and boiling coffee. That difference accumulated until the outcome was no longer reversible. Empires do not collapse only because they lose battles. They collapse when they can no longer feed their soldiers. And in World War II, one side ran out of food and fuel. The other did not.